There was one other. There was one other big player that got involved with 1MDB. This is a very, very complex money laundering exercise. Anyone who's read about it, the Singaporeans, said it's the most complicated money laundering investigation they've ever had to do. It's the biggest money laundering investigation, according to the Americans, that they've ever had to deal with. And once those charts go up, and you're seeing money, it's hard. But actually, the overall scheme, which is what I'm going to stick to, was simple. Huge sums of money, big tranches siphoned out, and two main deals. The second one was with the adalah fund, which was a subsidiary of 1MDB, a subsidiary of IPIC, which is a sovereign wealth fund in Abu Dhabi, and that was after Petrosaudi. They moved on to adalah, and of course this I knew as well when I was handing around Hollywood. And the gentleman on the right, shaking the hands of the sheikhs, he's the chief executive officer of adalah. And as I was trying to get new stories, on 1MDB, I even managed to justify a trip, as you gathered, to Hollywood. Something really interesting, there'd been a lot of lashback about my questions about Reza's source of funding for Wolf of Wall Street. And eventually, lo and behold, this guy from a bar comes out and says, Jolo had nothing to do with this. I paid for the movie. And it was jaw-dropping, because, this guy's a chief executive, he's got a salary job, and he works for a sovereign wealth fund. And not only that, the conflict of interest was every bit as, questionable as that of Joy Low, because he was the other major partner of 1MDB. So, I kind of said, how come that's something that should shut me up? I then dug on a little bit further and found some very useful court records, which showed that Joe Low had been lying. And again, this is just, this is where a journalist comes in. We're just, we niggle away. We can't do the big stuff, but we showed he'd been lying because 1MDB, according to a court case that was filed here in London, had financed an attempt by Joe Low to buy out the biggest hotel group in London, including Claridge's hotel here. And it was all there in black and white. Now, Joe Low had been going around saying, as I remind you, that he'd had nothing to do with 1MDB or any of these guys, since May of 2009. This bid was in 2011. So then I kind of got my real haul of information, and of course that's Paul Xavier Justo, who I'd heard about as I'd been digging and digging and digging. Anyone had any information on 1MDB, and I heard that there was someone who'd mentioned to someone that he did. And it took me about 6 months to persuade Xavier. I'm dreading having to meet him when he gets out of jail. But we understand, and he understands. Xavier had a massive data on that Petrosaudi deal. He had been a director of Petrosaudi. He had joined the company shortly after they'd landed this enormous deal with 1MDB. And he was able to tell me everything that happened, and he gave me a dossier. He was trying to sell it, and that was used very much against us. In the end, he gave it. He didn't receive any money. I introduced him to the head of the Edge newspaper group in Singapore. It's been a much documented story. He was forced into a dreadful confession when he was in jail in Thailand over a year ago. Told that if he said whatever they wanted him to say, he'd get out. Well, he's still in there, of course. This was him being arrested. It was, as you can see, very much a staged arrest. You've got the cameraman there from the New Straits Times, who was there waiting and ready. It was very much orchestrated by his former colleagues at Petrosaudi and by the Malaysians. The information that I extracted from those files was devastating. The first $1 billion invested by 1MDB had been put into a joint venture with this Petra Saudi nobody outfit. And then nobody'd known what, nothing happened, and everyone wondered. And what I was to be able to prove from the data and from photographs like this that were actually in the data as well, it was the server for the company, was exactly how they plotted it. And you've got the lineup here for the first bunch of plotters. Jolo again. Next to him, Prince Turki Abdullah Al Saud, and he was the seventh son of the then king of Saudi Arabia, and he was the key man in all this, standing on the right-hand side of Najib. In fact, he did nothing, but he had a share, a 50% share in the company, and this enabled this scheme that they had, which was to present 1MDB as something so high up, so sovereign, wealthy, state to statey, government to government, diplomatic immunity style enterprise that no one could question it. Relations with Saudi Arabia were at stake. And looking through all the presentation to all the bankers and bureaucrats that had to be sort of mollified really by this very unusual deal. It was always said, this is the king of Saudi Arabia's company, you can't question this, we have to drive it through. This is about, investment by Saudi Arabia into Malaysia. Now, well, there's, going on in ascending importance, Rosma, the very, very forceful wife of the Prime Minister. Next to her, one of her sons, and then Tariq Abeid. And then on the far end, Rosma's daughter, who had the most expensive series of weddings a few months later that Malaysia, probably Southeast Asia, has ever witnessed. And no one could work out how those weddings were paid for because, the Najibs were not rich. Najib Razak was not rich. So what I was later to be able to show is that actually they're on a yacht there that they hired and pretended, the Petra Saudi boys hired it and pretended it belonged to Prince Turki, the Tatoosh. It didn't, they were all conning each other really. I mean, there was no money in Petra Saudi whatsoever. They were just a bunch of adventurers trying to flog this contact they had. And it's just absolutely wonderful. Rosna thought it was fantastic. She believed it all. She thought, that he was a fantastically rich prince. But what they agreed was that they were going to do this deal. They were going to do this joint venture. And the emails from the server show me that the following week, Tariq, who had no business brain at all, contacted his pal Patrick, introduced him by email to Joe Lowe. Patrick then, flies first class to New York to meet Joe Lowe, where he was working out of. They had, they booked a restaurant, the most expensive restaurant in the world. I forget the name of it actually, Kobe. And sat down to lunch, and then 2 days later, Patrick writes a very useful, informative email to Joe Lowe, saying how, further to their discussions, he's very happy to act as a front for the plans that they had put together. One of the hallmarks of all the 1MDB deals is that fantastically expensive investments are made in lightning speed. So within 2 weeks, the $1 billion investment in the joint venture deal had been processed, 2.5. The second half of September. The Prime Minister, for reasons best known to him, maybe I'll find out why the 29th of September had to be the day, but he'd said, the big boss they all called him, he said that he wanted this deal signed by the 29th of September, and it was. The companies involved hadn't even been incorporated when Patrick Marnie flew back from New York. In fact, he had to get 15 lawyers in from White and Case who sort of camped in their cramped offices. They didn't have fancy offices in those days. They were hiring something at the back end of Victoria, actually. They now occupy number 1 Curzon Street. It was an overnight transformation, which was their downfall, actually. So this deal was pushed through, and the way they did it was to have a construct where Petra Saudi created a joint venture company and then imposed lent it some money, some fictitious money. They lent it fictitiously $700 million. And 1MDB's management agreed that, when they bought into the joint venture, they would pay back and who would enter such an agreement? I mean, it was laughable. The only reason why the management were willing to do all this, and actually the management of 1MDB were only told about the deal on the 15th of the month. The deal was signed on the 29th. So this was driven through with lightning speed. There was an excuse, which was a lie. The excuse was that PetroSaudi had an oil field in the Caspian Sea, and that they were injecting this oil field into the joint venture, and so therefore, the 700 million was justified. They were bringing all this amazing amount of money in. And indeed, Edward Morse, an American banker, who used to be a Republican energy Undersecretary of State, actually. He was an out-of-work banker at that time. He's now the head of commodities at Citibank. He kindly, based on information provided by Patrick Marnie, provided a valuation of the company, which he took one day to provide, saying that it was worth $2.9 billion. The company didn't actually belong to PetroSaudi. They'd paid some money to the actual company that owned it to sort of borrow the ownership for a couple of weeks. And one of the first things they had to do after the deal was signed was quickly, get out of that deal. Otherwise, they'd have had to have bought the company. There was no oil anyway. It was in a disputed region of the Caspian Sea, and they've never been able to get at the oil. So it was 100% total fraud, scam. And the board of 1MDB was... as we later found out, just steamrollered. They'd absolutely prohibited all of this, but it happened. So I got all this information, and it was a great story.